about some common mistakes the companies are making? I mean, they're getting on board with this whole big data thing, but maybe they're going down some wrong paths. I mean, as the three of you look out in the marketplace, what are some common mistakes and maybe some mistakes to avoid? Marcia, what's your sense of that?
Well, one area that concerns me a lot has to do with security. So that as you begin looking at and incorporating much more different types of data, greater variety of data, you are opening up many more avenues towards with possibilities of security, and perhaps even there's customer data in your big data analysis, and the data scientist or the business user is really just focused on finding a solution and looking for these insights, but they may lose sight of the fact that they're really working with personal information.
And this is Judith. One of the reasons that happens is because often when you bring data sets together, it may override the masking that was there that protected and the anonymous data, and all of a sudden it reappears. So then that definitely becomes an issue. If that data then becomes circulated, you've exposed data that you're not supposed to.
Could be even some legal issues involved there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Fern, your sense about that?
Well, I definitely agree with what Judith and Marcia are saying in terms of security and privacy. Certainly, we've heard a lot about that, over the past month.
Yeah, the Snowden issue. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to take it in another direction about in terms of some of the mistakes, and I agree with the anonymizing and pseudonymizing data that people are talking about now. Even though my understanding is even with a couple of data points, like you might think you anonymize the data, but it's very easy if you sell it to someone else for them to figure out who you're talking about. You may have 3 data points and that doesn't have the person's name, but it has enough information that it's easy enough to actually go against another data source and figure out who they are. But I guess in terms of mistakes, I've seen companies building sort of, I don't want to say it's a build it and they will come, but some companies are, they're just taking sort of all their data, throwing it together, and and that's fine. And I've seen them actually come up with some really amazing stuff, but they didn't have a roadmap. They didn't necessarily think about what their business case was in the first place. And what happens to them is they get to a certain point, and everything looks good, but then things start to implode on itself, and the politics start to come aboard. All of a sudden some executive realizes that, oh, you've taken my data, and I want a piece of this, and I want to put it in the cloud. I don't want to do it this way. I want to do it that way. So there's a lot of political issues, as well as there's actually understanding cultural issues. You're asking people to sort of do things a different way. You're going to change processes as things get more advanced, and those are some of the mistakes, actually not sort of thinking through that up front. But I really do think that it's important, even if we're talking about this hypothesis free and setting algorithms to work and whatnot. And I think that's important in terms of exploring the data, sure, but I think that before you go off and actually start putting big budgets, you have to know the business problem that you're trying to solve. And that's always really important. Judith and Marcia were saying that before, and that's a mistake I see companies making also.
Another issue that we have seen is there are a lot of pilots going on right now. And these are great because it allows people to try out tools that they're not familiar with, try different types of big data analytics, but that one of the risks is that they now create many more silos of data than they had before. So without a real plan, you end up with a lot more data silos. Nothing is connected. The data is out of sync with each other, and you can lose track of what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at where companies are, with their big data deployments, we actually at TDWI did a survey about a couple months ago, and it was basically of large and mid-sized companies based on where we did the survey. But the survey showed that only 25% of companies, that set of companies, weren't thinking about big data. Meaning like 3/4 of the companies were thinking about big data.
Okay.
And that's actually consistent, I think, with an IBM study, also a big study that they did recently. But just because you're either thinking about it, doing pilots, or actually, have some things at work doesn't mean that you're mature, in terms of what you're doing, with big data, in terms of thinking through a lot of the issues. As Judah said, you can have a couple pilots going, and you might have a company. Popular use case that I see is a company that has large volumes of structured data, and they're running predictive analytics on it. That's sort of one of sort of that's a big data use case. I mean, you could have tens of terabytes of data and you're running predictive analytics on it, but that doesn't mean that you're mature in terms of what you're doing. Yeah, you got that done, but are you mature in terms of your organization and your governance and your how you treat your data, and the skills, that planning for the future, those sorts of things that you're not really necessarily that mature about.
And I think one of the reasons why that's so hard is because we're talking a lot about the traditional sort of back end, as we call the back end sources of data, your traditional systems of record, of your customer information, your product information, and then we're introducing all of these newer sources of unstructured data, and in terms of what data needs to be integrated, how is it going to be integrated, how are you going to look for the consistency between your traditional sources and the newer sources. It's a complicated process. Yet there, as everyone's been saying, there are some incredible use cases where there's lots of innovative uses of whether it's understanding, not just in understanding customer sentiment, but great advances in healthcare, in environmental uses, and we can actually talk a little bit about some examples of successes with big data.